to jump into some fault finding missions, and we need to kind of look into some troubleshooting stuff, you know, jobs I did that I kept up with what I did and wrote about them and all that. And some of these are pretty interesting stories. We'll see what you think about them though. The first one we had was a 2000 Maxima. It was running rough and hot at idle, but it did okay on the road. So it ran a little hot at idle, ran a little rough at idle, but on the road it didn't run hot and it didn't run rough. Well, we had a rolling idle when we started. It would stall intermittently, and one of my guys found a split air inlet tube. I had already taught these guys about unmetered air, and so that took care of that problem. I had to get a tube ordered for it, and sometimes those air inlet tubes can cost $100. They're not a good way to fix them really, where they'll stay fixed. You know, it's just the best idea. In addition to the air they're pulling in there, they're also pulling unfiltered air that's dirty, and you don't want to dust the engine and wipe it out, you know, which it has happened, you know, because of cracked air cleaners or whatever. Well, this running hot sitting at idle, it turned out, was because of an inoperative fan. I don't know how this happened, but fan 1 had a pushed back terminal. Fan 2 was dead as a hammer, and it wouldn't run either. And so we wound up putting a set of fans on it. You know, you get the housing with the fans and all that, and put them on there and plug them in. After that, everything was great. This is these Nissan. I used to have a schematic like this. Look at these relays, these complicated relays. There's 3 relays built into this intelligent power distribution module that have to do with the fan. And the CPU, if you'll notice, actually turns those on. And I actually asked a question on one of my electrical exams. It was sort of a bonus question. And what I was saying was, what would happen if you were to close all 3 of these relays at once? And I said, look at the schematic, study the schematic, tell me what would happen if you energized all 3 of them at once. And so that takes a lot of figuring. If you want to try to figure this out, you can. If you want to send me a message, and I figured it out, as a matter of fact, and I actually created a schematic showing what would happen. And if you've watched my channel for a long time, I may have mentioned this before, but I figured out what would happen if all 3 of them were closed at the same time. It was just an interesting setup they've got here. But anyway, these motors, you might notice, have got 4 brushes. 1 brush, 2 brush, 3 brush, 4 brush. And that's for your various different speeds. And so all you got to do to really check this, using my test light thing, is hook the negative to pin 4, and you're going to get the pin out for your connector. I got that down here too. And then you hook your test light to the other side, so that the power going through this test light and through that motor is going through those brushes back to the battery. And you turn that motor. If that light ever goes off, you've got a bad fan motor, and that's the end of it. Because if it ever stops on that dead spot, the motor won't run. But anyway, that's how you check one of these fans. And this, like I say, this is extremely complex here, and it'll drive you nuts just trying to look at it and see what's going on. This is a different Nissan with AC issues. It would start out cooling well, and then the cooling would fade away as it warmed up. And did a refrigerant sniff. We got 100% 134A. That was good. It was full whenever we looked at our pressures and stuff. But with the AC engaged, the high side pressure kept climbing and climbing and climbing really, really high. I never saw it, you know, bust the pop-off valve on the compressor loose, but I guess it could have if it kept going. One of the fans was really slow, and the other one was DOA, just kind of like that other Nissan. And the fan replacement handled that issue, took care of it. But this is what you had with bad fans. See these pressures? Low side pressure was way up here. High side pressure was nearly 450. But whenever we put the fans on there and they were running like they were supposed to, low side pressure wasn't a whole lot lower, but look at the difference in that high side pressure, and the air conditioner was cool as a cucumber. So pay attention to those fans, and if it's got a belt-driven fan with a viscous fan clutch, pay attention to that too, because those things, not only can they lock up and make it sound like it's running too fast, but they can also fail to do anything and not draw any air through, so that whenever you're sitting still, you'll have a higher head pressure, and it may start squealing the belt or something like that, you know. Now this was a low-riding Lincoln town car. Most everybody that has seen one of these town cars or one of these Crown Victorias with these rear air springs on them has seen this kind of thing. Basically what I like to do is buy the little kit that comes with the springs and the shocks, and I like to go ahead and get those springs out of there, the air springs out. It's easy to do. You get those air springs out, take the shocks off, lower it, the rear end, and put regular springs in there that come in that kit. Cost a couple of $100 last time I bought one, maybe higher now. Put that thing back on there. Now you usually, if you didn't know exactly how to prevent it, you would see an air suspension light forevermore. But my dad had a 2001 Grand Marquis, and I replaced the air springs on his because every time when he went out there to get in it, the springs themselves, the rubber part was leaking air, and it would always be flat when he went out there. And after he drove it a little bit, it would, raise back up. But anyway, this low-riding town car, the customer said she'd been able to fiddle with the switch in the trunk to get it to work sometimes. Now this is a switch you're supposed to switch off if you're going to jack one of these up. If you raise one of them up on the lift without turning that switch off, people say, oh no, they'll overfill the airbags and bust them. No, that's not what'll happen. It will detect a really high riding car, and it will let all the air out of the bags. When you lower it down, it's sitting so hard on the lift because it's got no air springs under it that you can't even get the lift out from under it until you let the compressor pump the airbags back up. Now some of those air pumps on these earlier cars have a little Schrader valve up around the pump where you could put air in there yourself. That kind of went away after, real soon after they started putting this air suspension on here. The GM air suspension works a different way. The compressor was working fine though, and we could trigger it to run, and we could open the air spring solenoids and it would air the springs up. So we knew the compressor was okay. Now there's also a vent solenoid on the compressor that when it's energized, it lets the air out of the springs. See, so basically those are both part of the same unit. The vent solenoid, and there's only one of those, and the two air spring solenoids. If you've got one of the Mark 8s or whatever that's got 4 springs, it'll have 4 solenoids and all that, and those little plastic lines. And this part right here, incidentally, is the filter, and that filter can be replaced separately from the pump, I think. These air springs look kind of like a big injector, and they work vaguely similar to that, but that line just shoves in there and it locks, and you got to push down on this orange thing to release that line to get it out of there. And of course that's what those springs look like right here whenever you're looking under there. Now this is how it's wired. I usually like to simplify these schematics and get rid of all the circuit numbers and connector numbers and all that because it's easier to look at. Notice how the on-off switch, these are power out, power input. So this power right here goes back to this pin here. When you turn that off, it basically shuts this whole module down so that it's not doing anything except turning on the air suspension light. But the EVO steering, which is a part of the module, will still work. That's electronic variable assist steering. And, it basically makes the steering a little stiffer when you're driving down the highway and easier when you're doing parking lot maneuvers and that kind of thing. But anyway, I'm going to erase those two things right there, but that's all part of the same. Now, not all of these have the EVO built into that same module, but this particular one does. Now, some of these systems have got power going to the air spring solenoids and the module grounds them. This particular one sends power. Notice they're hardwired to ground, these air spring solenoids are, and it sends power out to them. Now that's kind of like an RE401 Nissan transmission. It's got the transmission solenoids hardwired to ground, and the computer sends power out to them. Some of your Asian transmissions were built that way, like the 4EAT that was in the Escort and the Probe and all. It was made that way. It had the solenoid hardwired to ground, and it would shoot power out to them instead of the other way around, which is what we're used to. Now, so you notice you got your vent solenoid here and your air suspension compressor built into the same unit, right? And then there's a relay there that powers that up. And the vent control solenoid and the compressor have got two different deals here. See, the compressor relay control. But when this is turned on, this is going to be running the whole time, even if that thing's venting. You might notice that. Boy, I just really made a mess out of all that, didn't I? Anyway, so anyway, you can see kind of how that's wired up. And there's a lot of them cars still running around out there. But like I say, I always like to just put regular springs under them. It doesn't hurt anything. You don't have more trouble with them after that. The data stream scan on this one found out the module was only seeing 8.6 volts. Now we measured the voltage going into the module that it was supposed to be reading, and we saw battery voltage there. But when you looked at the scan tool, you didn't see but 8.6 volts that it was reading on its little data parameters. And so if any of these modules doesn't see enough voltage for it to do its job well, the module will just not do what it's supposed to do. That's what modules do. They don't see enough voltage, they don't work. I mean, the algorithms are programmed to where they won't even try to do their job. Like, for example, when you're spinning an engine over, a lot of the time, if like on these Fords, if the battery voltage while you're spinning it, even if it sounds like it's spinning good, if it drops below about 7.5 volts, it won't even operate the injectors, in spite of the fact that if it did operate, it would probably start the motor. Power stroke diesels are like that, the ones that I worked on. If the voltage goes too low, it won't even begin to operate the injectors. So you got to pay attention to that cranking voltage if you want to see what's going on. Now this Buick Rendezvous had 70,000 miles on it. It was a hard start, had lost power, and went to another shop somewhere, and they put $130 set of spark plugs in it, but that didn't fix a darn thing. I don't really understand people charging somebody to put plugs in it. Of course, they can say, well, it needed plugs, but we don't know what else is wrong with it. I wouldn't really feel right about that unless I could follow through and finish fixing the vehicle, right? That's just me. I don't know how the rest of you guys feel about that, but somebody, putting spark plugs is pretty much something just about anybody can do, But this one here turned out had a recurring P0171 code, and the long fuel trims were high. We did a smoke check, no vacuum leaks on the intake or anything. The fuel pressure was only like a little over 35 psi, and we snap a throttle, we'd see it drop, which is a good thing to do. If you pull the fuel pressure regulator vacuum hose, it'll jump up a little bit, and if you snap the throttle just sitting still, and you see that pressure drop when you snap the throttle, that fuel pump is weak. Of course, you need to put a filter on it too, and you may even want to put a filter on it first just to see if the filter is the issue, but just about every time I've ever seen that, it's always been the pump. And the ones that were really bad were the motor homes that would come in with 80 gallons of gas in them, and we'd find a bad fuel pump, because when they start losing power, they'd immediately fill it all the way up with gas. So I had to pull that 80-gallon gas tank off of there and put a fuel pump in it. Some of them you could get the fuel pump out of there without doing that, but it was a bear anyway. And this Jeep Grand Cherokee had an AC issue. There weren't no juice in it. Did a vacuum test, didn't find any decay, but like I said on a previous one, you're typically going to do better finding a leak if it's where you can see it by charging it up with dry nitrogen at about 150 psi, because the pressure differential is higher. If you pull all the air out, you've only got about, atmospheric pressure was 14 pounds or whatever, and so it may hold a vacuum and still be leaking under pressure. See, that's the thing. I ran some dye in there and ran the AC for a bit and just watched it. And look what came out of that evaporator drain. We had dye dripping on the floor. And so the green juice told us that we had a leaky evaporator. So what we did is we put an evaporator in there. You can see where that one there was leaking. And we also replaced the high pressure line, the liquid line, I say that. The liquid line on this one has the orifice tube built into it, as you can see here. Now I cut that apart just so I could look at it, and that orifice tube was in pretty bad shape. And then we also put a dryer and a receiver dryer and an expansion valve on it. Remember, if it's got a expansion valve, it'll have a receiver dryer. And that. All right, this 2008 Charger, you had to start it about 100 times, try to start it about 100 times before it would do anything. And finally, after you switched it off, tried and tried and tried, where you stick that little thing into the little slot on the dash and you turn it over to try to start it. And this is actually also a fob. Absolutely, this guy, the welding instructor, it was his son's car, and he kept fooling with it at home until he got it started and drove it up there for us. We never could get it to start, no matter how many times we tried. But anyway, that was what we were going after, what we were going to fix. So we wondered if the total integrated power module might be the problem, because you know that was scan tool wouldn't talk, CAN bus was dead, and we was wondering. So the owner produced a used total integrated power module he had already bought from a salvage yard somewhere that was the right one for that car, and we put it on there. It didn't fix a dadgum thing. I'm kind of glad that we didn't buy one and put it on there and find out it didn't fix it. We lucked out that time because he already had one. You know, a lot of them older shop manuals, even in particular with Ford and all, whenever you had exhausted all your trouble tree, they would say, substitute a known good module. Well, if you don't have a known good module, you're sunk, you know. Well, the wireless ignition node, which is the thing you stick your little key fob thing in to turn, that basically, it's a CAN module that wakes up the bus and all the other modules when you're switched on, and this one wouldn't usually do that. And so the new one was really expensive. But what we did was, it had power and ground. And if it's had power and ground and it's not working, then, you know, any module that's got power and ground that's not doing what it's supposed to do, you typically feel like, well, I know what's wrong with it now. We sent that thing to a rebuilder in San Antonio. We found it would refurbish it for $149, but we had to send the module and both of the key fobs with it. We did that. We fixed it, got it back. All right, it started right up every time, but the door locks wouldn't work unless the key was turned on. Okay, that was an interesting thing. You know, the door locks need to work when you turn off the key, don't you think? I'm talking about when you're pushing the button with the fob. All right, with the key on, the lock buttons and the fobs worked fine. So the accessory delay problem wasn't working right. The windows and the radio always worked even after the door was open. You know, usually they'll stay on until you open the door if you get it switched off. And a lot of them are like that now. General Motors always call that retained accessory power. And initially they had a module that would do that, and they called it a wrap module. Well, Ford had a wrap module too, but it stood for remote anti-theft personality and did a totally different job. So if you're getting a wrap module for the GM, it's different than a wrap module for a Ford. But anyway, the courtesy lights wouldn't work unless the key was on. Wasn't that weird? Now, what I like to do in a situation like this is figure out what all these different things that aren't working right have in common, right? All right, so it had no idea the doors were open, and the cluster seemed to be the module that was receiving those inputs, okay? So I said, okay, the cluster is what all these things have in common. See, we never were even able to, we wouldn't have detected this problem anyway. He never told us about it. He just brought the car and said it wouldn't start. And then we discovered all this after we got it going. We couldn't stop and just give it back to him like as we had to keep on chasing this thing. Well, what we found out was fuses 14 and 17 both feed the instrument cluster. And we found out that fuse 14 was missing. This fuse here was not even there. And so I could probably get a different color on that. This fuse here wasn't even there. And so since it wasn't even in there, we went ahead and put the 10 amp fuse in there, and everything came awake and started to work. So see that one circuit that was going to the, of course you got your module intrusion transceiver too, if you've got a right-hand drive car on that one, that's a different thing. But anyway, that right there, let me go back to my red. This circuit right here not being powered up was enough to cause all those other problems. And see, we managed to just, what we did was we found out the cluster is what's the unifying part of all, you know, all of these things are connected to the cluster somehow. And because you got modules telling stuff what to do. This is an '08 model. Think about how old this car was. And think about a lot of these vehicles, how old they are, and all these electronic modules. And you don't know the way they interact with one another if you don't have a good description and operation. And sometimes even then, you don't know. You might remember that '98 Buick I worked on. That's another story. But somebody had planted this bug even before we saw the car. I don't know why he pulled that number 10 fuse out. The first time I ever ran into a problem where a missing fuse kicked me around was back in 1984 when I was fixing the cruise control. The service manager gave me about 7 cruise control jobs in one day, and I got to where I knew that system inside out. But one of them kind of beat me up until I realized, you know, I checked all the fuses, but I realized that the fuse that fed the cruise was not even there. Somebody had yanked it. And you might remember that little Toyota Avalon, I guess it was. Some kind of car, somebody had moved a fuse and caused it to start hard. So anyway, if somebody pulls a fuse out, you don't need to just check the fuses that are there. You need to check the system you're working on and make sure that the fuse that feeds the system you're working on is there. And that's how we pretty much found this one. Well, that's all for this week. Get some work done, and hey, let's be careful out there.